Hey everyone, welcome to another hardware news recap for the week. And this one, we'll be talking about Intel's Xe graphics and its gradual approach to a dGPU launch. In this news item, it actually explicitly mentioned that it's working towards a discrete GPU to compete with, obviously, NVIDIA and AMD. We'll be talking about AMD's purchasing and quarterly earnings, some RX 6000 follow-ups too. We saw some pretty common questions across the comment sections for the RX 6000 news. And so we compiled a couple of those, and we're going to be trying to help shed some light on a few of the most common topics. Talking about RX 6000 partner release timing as well, which was another common question. Intel Rocket Lake S details and some additional information provided about that. And then Zhaoxin acquiring more x86 IP. Before that, this video is brought to you by Linode. Linode is a Linux server provider that GN has used for years now for its own servers. Alongside dedicated hosting, Linode also makes it easy to cut out third-party VPN servers and to build your own VPN that you fully control, doable through a few guided clicks in its interface. Linode has hundreds of guides for even more advanced server builds, and with Linode, you can roll out your own services like Plex and Nextcloud for your own media and file sharing services. Gamers Nexus viewers get a $100 credit, good for 60 days on new Linode accounts. Visit linode.com/gamersnexus or click the link in the description below. So first up, a quick GN news item, some updates about what we're working on, store, stuff like that. We just launched the GN Bar Runner, and whenever we launch a new product, I like to do a short thing in one of the news videos because we spend a huge amount of time on all of the products we work on, and I like to give some behind the scenes of what went on in the design process, why the sampling and the QC process takes so long, the way we do it, stuff like that. So to quickly catch you up, if you didn't see the announcement video on the Bar Runner, the Bar Runner is a bar mat that we fully custom designed. It's got computer hardware themes, PC components across the mat. So for example, it has a CPU socket with smaller CPU pins. And as minor of a detail as this seems, those were really hard to get right in the molding, because there's sort of a size cutoff where it'll come out really well, like they did, and then it doesn't come out well. So we had to do a lot of sampling back and forth to improve it to the point where it is now. We have RAM slots in it, PCIe slots, inductors, capacitors, even a CMOS battery made out of the silicone rubber, and the battery is a half height surrounded by the cage too. So some really small attention to detail there by our designer, Andrew, who worked on this. And the mat is great for use as a tabletopper next to a keyboard, as a drying mat next to your sink or dishwasher, or for use at an actual bar or home bar. It's spill-proof, it's easily washable, and it measures 610 by 127 by 8 millimeters, or 24 inches by 5 inches, and we have them in stock and shipping now. But we did sell through our combo pack of 4 pint glasses and 1 bar runner in just 12 hours, with more glasses on the way. So for the behind the scenes manufacturing info on this, in the announcement video, we said it took about 9 months of QC, molding work, design revisits to get this thing done. And to give you some insight to why it took so long, the perspective is basically we started this design in late January or thereabouts. And the design revisions, so our first sample, we went back through and we were like, we could do like a gradient slope on some of these features. So like the GN logo, for example, has a gradient for the edges. And so we did that. The factory we worked with, although it's done a lot of bar runners, has never done a gradient in its mold for a bar runner. No one's requested that before in its clientele. So they had to do that for us. Not too hard, but it did take an additional sampling revision. And then we also had to thicken the rubber in a few places, so we changed the design to reinforce the mat in a couple of key areas to make it stronger. So for example, near the Nexus part, the N, was originally a little bit thinner, and we increased the thickness on that after one of our early samples. We then did a lot of color changes, color reworks to get the color exactly right. Another small attention to detail thing, we moved the components around the mat a couple of times to make sure you could put a glass down anywhere and it would have support on all sides of the glass. So it's like small stuff like that that matters from a product perspective, but you could definitely overlook when you're in the early stages of design. And it's always, honestly, extremely eye-opening for us as reviewers to go through the product manufacturing process. When we first started making stuff, not just shirts, but like the mod mats, one of the things I said, if you've been with us for about 3 or 4 years at this point, you'll maybe remember this. One of the things I said was that the product design process, getting into it, really gave us some perspective on what manufacturers have to go through for products that in many cases are far more complex, like a computer case where you're spending $400,000 on the tooling alone. And so it really helps inform our decisions on how we're going to approach reviewing a thing. It gives us better information on how the tooling, the molding, the sampling process works. So when we're talking to these companies and trying to figure out why didn't you do X, Y, Z, we speak the same language, we can understand what they're saying, and then we can determine for ourselves if it makes sense rather than just take it at face value, which is what we used to have to do before we manufacture anything. So anyway, if you're like, if you're just curious about the behind the scenes stuff from a media outlet manufacturing things, that's kind of the insight we take away from it, is how does it influence our reviews. Two final quick updates just before getting into the other stuff. Is time bars on the side, of course, if you want. But one quick update on the 1 million subs shirt. That is in manufacturing, and we're going to hit our targeted release timelines for that are on the store page and have been there. So that's expected to arrive in our warehouse by late November, at which point it will begin shipping out to you all. And then we've restocked the anniversary mugs as well if you're interested in one of those. Okay, first major story, Intel Xe Max graphics and its approach to dGPUs. So this is actually a mobile announcement, but it's leading into discrete graphics and eventually cards for desktops, obviously. On October 31st, Intel announced its Intel Iris Xe Max graphics, not to be outdone by NVIDIA and AMD. The company says this is a mobile GPU that will be included in new laptops effective immediately, and it indicated that the Xe Max graphics will be based on XeLP architecture as found in the Intel Iris Xe 11th Gen mobile components. Whenever going through product announcements like this, we don't really have that moment of self-realization, at least I don't, until I'm reading all of the letters and numbers pushed together on camera. And then you kind of go, huh, if I ever wanted to sound really smart to someone who doesn't follow the computer world, all I would have to do is read a bunch of Intel names, and they would be like, wow, that guy seems insane. Or they'd think I'm really smart because the name Intel XeLP Iris 11th Gen mobile components. It just sounds like you know what you're talking about, or not at all. Intel says that this is the first Xe-based GPU, discrete GPU, as it works to enter the dGPU market. Intel made comparisons in one sense against the RTX 2080, but there's a specific caveat for that, and otherwise against an MX350 NVIDIA GPU. So to be frank, we're not that familiar at GN with components like the MX350. It's a bit too low end, so it's out of our coverage spectrum. We'd know a GTX or an RTX series one if we saw one in mobile, but we don't pay attention to the MX300 series stuff. It's a Pascal GPU. It's got just over 600 CUDA cores for reference, so it's a part that we don't typically cover. The company also offered a slide entitled Hyper-Encoding, Single Stream Proof of Concept, which indicated performance as, quote, 2 times projected over the RTX 2080. Intel later clarified that this is specifically for encoding against NVEncoder, so don't expect 2 times the rasterization performance. For specs, Intel Iris Xe Max graphics will run 96 EUs, and the clock will be 1650 megahertz. Intel says it will use 10 nanometer super fin lithography, which it detailed not too long ago, and this leads again into Intel's eventual push into more GPU launches, which will be targeted at some level for desktop computers. Up next, an update on RX 6000 partner timing. So we spoke with a couple of board partners who make AMD GPUs, and we asked them, hey, when do you plan to launch these cards? So if you haven't noticed, with NVIDIA's launches, the way they've staggered it is NVIDIA has its own launch day for FE, and then it forces its partners to launch 2 days later. So it allows a little bit of time for FE to sell first. And in the case of AMD's RX 6000 series, we were asking the partners, are you doing it the same way, or is some other setup? And current understanding is that most of the partners plan to have general availability within a few weeks of launch. So some of them are anticipating 1 week, and a couple of others we spoke to were saying within 3 weeks. And that's kind of the timelines we're looking at for partner model cards, meaning non-reference or non-whatever AMD calls it, Founders Edition equivalent cards, typically reference though. And then for availability, for quantity, we asked around a bit as well and kind of hesitated to ask these questions. So when we asked AMD, think we said this in our AMD news video, if you need the specs and all the details, all the deeper level stuff, go watch the AMD news announcement that we posted. It's going to have a lot more than this. But I think one of the things we said there was that the expectations for quantity, AMD basically said, we anticipate doing the best we can to meet market demand type of thing. So not really a whole lot of info. through insiders, we learned that AMD is expecting to have inventory for maybe a couple of hours after launch. And depending on how it staggers the rollout of inventory, maybe it'll look like it hangs on for a little bit longer over the next few days. And then from partners, they're mixed on it, depending on allocation. Obviously, each partner gets different allocation, but some of them are saying that they aren't much better off than the NVIDIA inventory per capita, so like adjusted for the sales expectations of AMD versus NVIDIA cards. And then some of them are saying they think they'll be fine. So in short, who the hell knows? You've probably seen some expectations on quantity out there. At this point, at least at GN, we're just going to ignore them and see what happens on launch day, because everybody's saying different stuff when we ask them. So it's not like typically you'll get kind of a cohesive answer, but right now the info we're getting on RX 6000 availability is just too mixed to call whether one's accurate or the other's accurate. So we wanted to just deliver that amount of information to you and then say we're not going to bother reporting on availability until the product hits, and then we'll probably still focus on product level details, performance, things like that. And if you can't get it, sorry, we're still going to review the cards, but the reviews will still be valid, still be useful when you can eventually get one, so you'll at least know when they become available if you should buy model X or Y. So that's our plan anyways, just focus on the product level stuff primarily. Might talk about availability a little bit, but not a whole lot. So up next, some clarity on AMD's RX 6000 announcements. We saw some really common questions after the AMD announcement. First of all, we have a separate news video that goes in depth on everything. It's not just covering the Lisa Su on stage discussion. We actually had some time talking with AMD doing Q&A. So check out that news video for the full detail. But gonna recap a couple things that we saw common either confusion about or questions about. First of all, rage mode, as discussed in our news video, is not an overclock. It is not an auto overclock. There's a separate feature entirely called auto OC. That's overclocking. Rage mode, when you saw it referenced in, I hope the editors are still doing the flying rage mode things because that's a silly name, but it's a throwback. Rage mode basically increases the board power. It's equivalent to sliding the power slider in Wattman or Precision or Afterburner a little bit to the right. So it's going over 100% power target. It does not fully max out the slider from what AMD told us at least, but it's keeping it, quote, within spec, whatever that means, we don't know at this time, and is responsible for about 1 to 2% of the performance uplift in the presentation slide where AMD showed SAM, or Smart Access Memory, plus Rage Mode. They had the two kind of obfuscated mixed together and showing anywhere from, I think it was maybe 2% at the low end, something like that, 2 or 3%, up to 13% was the outlier at the high end, and then 8% was kind of the end of the normal range. So of those percentages, AMD told us in a direct meeting that Rage Mode is responsible for 1 to 2% of that total percentage. So percentage points, so if it's 13%, Rage Mode is worth up to 1 or maybe up to 2%, and then SAM, or Smart Access Memory, was worth the rest of it in that one instance. So that's what Rage Mode is. It is a power adjustment. It is not an overclock. The frequency will go up, but it's not because it's overclocking it, which is a specifically different thing where you're applying a frequency offset to the core. Instead, the frequency is going up through normal GPU boosting behavior, where there's boosting tables for both AMD and NVIDIA, and as you increase the power budget, it will push higher in frequency. So with NVIDIA, you might see, for example, if you slide voltage slider to 100 and you slide the power adjustment up, you might go from 2025 to 2040 megahertz on a 3070 or something, whereas with AMD, you'll see similar behavior on, well, everything back a couple of years actually, but especially Vega and especially RDNA 1, which is the most related. So that's what Rage Mode is. It is not an overclock in the sense of literal overclocking. It is a power adjustment, which means that Rage Mode is the least possible improvement you can get in terms of modifying your GPU's performance. So we don't know how it's going to overclock yet. They haven't shown those numbers. But in theory, if you're actually overclocking it, you should get more than what Rage Mode gives you, which is just a power adjustment only. Next thing, we saw a lot of confusion about SAM. To be extremely brief and clear on this, Smart Access Memory is very strictly one thing. It is when you have a Ryzen 5000 series CPU, you have a 500 series like an X570 motherboard, and you have an RX 6000 series video card. When you have all three of those things specifically and nothing else, then there is supposed to be a Smart Access Memory, we'll call it mode, that is in theory toggleable, at least because AMD did A/B tests and showed it toggled on/off on the same system. And what that does is allow the CPU to address the full memory on the GPU, and this is worth some percentage uplift. We'll have to do a whole lot of testing matrices for this one because there's a lot of complexity to things you can toggle on and off. So that's SAM. And if you want more detail on SAM, we talk about it in the AMD news piece. And then finally, DLSS. There are questions. We talked about this in the video as well. People missed it. Questions about if there would be a DLSS equivalent, and sort of is the answer. So AMD has a super resolution type feature it's working on. It is not VSR, it is not DSR, it is not quite DLSS either. And we asked AMD, before they told us it's not quite DLSS, should this super resolution thing be thought of as a counterpart, was the specific phrasing, to DLSS. AMD told us, well, we don't really want to compare it directly to DLSS because it is enacted on a broader level, was the phrasing used. So super resolution by AMD is supposed to be used, quote, more broadly. We're not quite sure what that means yet. It might just be how the developers implement it. It might be at a driver level instead of at a game level, whatever. Either way, there's a sort of kind of DLSS, but not quite DLSS equivalent. And it is not going to be ready, as we understand it now, for launch, and is something that it's working on immediately. So that's the current understanding of AMD's alternative to DLSS, is basically they're working on something, but it's not as specific and will be more broadly applied. Whether that's good or bad, obviously we'll see in testing, but the answer is yes, AMD is working on something. So enough catching everyone up on the AMD stuff, just really wanted to offer that extra clarity now that we had time to check the comments. AMD third quarter earnings. This was from a couple days ago at this point, but following Intel, AMD also announced its earnings for third quarter of 2020. Surprising no one at this point, AMD is reporting another standout quarter, and it's shaped by what is perhaps the most significant mobile portfolio in AMD's history and strong semi-custom sales for next-gen consoles. We'll have to wait for next quarter, or maybe quarter 121, to see the effect of Zen 3 and the RX 6000 series fully, but both product lines should be strong drivers of growth for the company if they work out well. Overall, AMD is reporting a quarterly revenue of $2.8 billion, a 56% jump year over year, and a 45% jump quarter over quarter. Again, this was primarily on the back of AMD's enterprise, embedded, and semi-custom, and its computing and graphics segments. Semi-custom, again, specifically, is the one that would benefit from Microsoft and Sony's upcoming consoles. And then additionally, in the mobile segment, there's record amount of mobile notebook processor shipments highlighting the quarter. AMD notes that it has also seen double-digit growth in those mobile GPU sales year over year, thanks to the Radeon Pro 5000M specifically, which is found in Apple's MacBook Pro. AMD's gross margin came in at 44%, which is 1 percentage point higher year over year. Additionally, operating income for the quarter was $449 million compared to $186 million year over year. AMD's computing and graphics segment, meanwhile, had a revenue of $1.67 billion, up 31% year over year or 22% quarter over quarter. AMD notes that this is primarily due to increased Ryzen processor sales, but also notes that the ASP, or the average selling price, for its client CPUs is down a bit due to strong sales for its mobile CPUs. Enterprise, embedded, and semi-custom segment revenue was $1.13 billion, marking a 116% jump year over year and 101% jump quarter over quarter. Again, this is thanks to the AMD semi-custom Ryzen chips powering next-gen consoles. AMD's semi-custom sales should remain healthy over the next few quarters as the Xbox Series X and S and PlayStation 5 get off the ground and start trying to meet demand. Aside from its strong quarter, AMD also is working on buying Xilinx for $35 billion. This is one we briefly mentioned in the last news video, but at the time we had filmed that one, the deal was literally only just initially announced minutes before filming. So aside from a strong quarter, AMD is reporting its acquisition of FPGA maker Xilinx, and the acquisition will cost AMD $35 billion, and it's going to be an all-stock transaction. The acquisition will bring AMD's TAM, or total addressable market, to $110 billion and should help power AMD's aggressive expansion in the data center market. With Xilinx, AMD's portfolio will now encompass CPUs and GPUs, but also FPGAs and adaptive SoCs, as well as bringing on Xilinx's software, enterprise, and engineering talent. With AMD's MCM, or multi-chip module, and chiplet module design it has embraced, it seems well-positioned to leverage specialized FPGAs within its EPYC CPUs to offer specialized processing for certain data center workloads. The deal is expected to close by end of 21, pending any regulatory hurdles that will need clearing. Until then, AMD and Xilinx will continue to operate as separate and independent companies. Intel has also decided to offer a brief preview of its CPU architecture behind Rocket Lake S, and this is in the form of detailing of Cypress Cove, which will underpin the new Rocket Lake S CPUs. So it's a bit odd for Intel, as it usually doesn't have these kinds of teases this far ahead of a launch. Normally you get this kind of stuff as press maybe a month or two ahead of launch, typically, or as the public right around launch. So this is pretty far in advance at this point and odd. Either way, the company is likely trying to steer some amount of the conversation back towards it and draw up some interest for its own parts, basically saying, hey, we're over here too, as AMD is working on its Zen 3 and Ryzen 5000 launch in the next couple of days, actually, at the time this video goes up. At any rate, Rocket Lake S looks to be a promising platform, albeit one that will likely remain on 14nm manufacturing technology. Cypress is a derivative of Intel's Sunny Cove that we've detailed in the past. It will mark the first S-series architecture shift since Skylake, and Intel expects a, quote, double-digit IPC increase. We don't have details on really much else at this point, cache, frequency, cores, much of anything, but that's what we've gotten so far. How that compares to the IPC increase Zen 3 will offer with Ryzen 5000 obviously remains to be seen, unfortunately. Kind of hate always saying we'll have to see what it is, but at the same time, the alternative is just speculating and pulling things out of thin air, and that doesn't benefit anyone. So, as expected, Rocket Lake S will move to PCIe Gen 4, finally, for Intel CPUs. It will bring a level of parity with AMD in that respect, at least. And Rocket Lake S will afford up to 20 PCIe lanes to the CPU, although Intel didn't mention how these would be allocated. So 4 of those might be NVMe, for example, with another 16 maybe for PEG or PCIe graphics. Rocket Lake S will also boast Intel's Xe graphics architecture in some capacity. Additionally, Intel looks to be leveraging one of its key advantages over AMD, which is overclocking. In its press release, Intel mentioned new overclocking features, but stopped short of saying what form those features would take. Intel's Rocket Lake S will drop into Intel's new 500 series boards and should arrive in the first quarter of 21. If you've watched our previous coverage of the Chinese x86 Zhaoxin CPUs, then you might be aware of a bit of the interesting history behind Zhaoxin and the CPUs. Namely, those CPUs in that piece we posted involved companies such as VIA. Back from seemingly the dead, they're actually still around. So it involved VIA, it involved Centaur for design, and a couple of other interesting players in the market. And there's a bit of news on that. So in the past week, there was a report that Zhaoxin would apparently receive a fresh update to its intellectual property, an injection of IP, and would be related to assets from VIA to allow it to continue its x86 development history. x86, again, as a reminder, is a licensed technology from Intel, and only a couple of companies hold it, AMD and VIA, basically. So the sub-licensing is rare. According to a statement via Tom's Hardware, quote, the company and its 100% owned subsidiaries, VIA Base and VIA Tech, sell some chipset products related intellectual property rights, excluding patent rights, to Shanghai Zhaoxin Semiconductor, in which VIA has indirect shareholding of 14.75%. We're not presently clear what IP is being transferred or sold, but it appears that VIA will still retain the right to leverage that IP in the future, as the sale doesn't include patents, and will still remain in possession of the x86 license it acquired through Cyrix and Centaur Technology. Quick update on AMD's mountain bike. So we killed it. It's currently gone from the store, and our understanding is that right now the discussion at AMD internally is whether or not the company wants to try again, fix the issues in place, and, well, it's actually not really possible, but attempt to fix the issues and keep rolling, or just kill the product entirely. So we actually received also a couple emails from people who have owned the Kent brand bikes, which is what is being rebranded by AMD, showing us how the pivot in the bottom can actually shear off completely from the bottom bracket, which is horrifying. So maybe not the safest bike to try and fix in place, but AMD, if you're listening, what we'd really like to see is just go partner with Specialized or Trek or Cannondale or even Canfield, whomever, and put out some like $1,300 rebrand of a $1,000 bike and do some, or $2,000 bike, whatever, and actually do something good. And I'll buy that too, and we'll do another review, because at least then you're working with a major company. Up next, Corsair water blocks. The only real reason this is in the news is because it's a $60 water block, so that's the main claim to fame for this one. It's an XC5 in the Hydro series, and while Corsair has had a couple of new products to announce recently, like the cases, 2 out of 3 of which we've reviewed, among the more interesting is potentially its affordable CPU water block. So this is aimed at attempting to make water cooling, custom water cooling, a bit more appealing, because obviously it's bringing the pricing down. It still maintains copper in the loop, so it hasn't gone aluminum to reduce the price. Obviously, we would be suspect of the performance of a $60 water block, but that's for a different piece. Either way, this is an XC5 with RGB, of course, because when you're cutting your costs on a water block to try and make a cheaper one, there's one thing you can't cut. It's RGB. You can cut everything else. RGB you have to keep though. So that is compatible, the block that is, not the RGB. That's compatible with LGA 1200, 11.5X from Intel, and AM4 from AMD for the sockets. And that's about all there is to this one. So that's it for this one. As always, you can subscribe for more, or you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly. Grab one of our new bar runners in stock and shipping now and shipping worldwide. These are awesome. I'm really proud with how they came out, and pretty happy about it. Also selling crazy well, so thank you for all of the support as always. And yeah, check back for more. We'll see you all next time.